Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, the podcast that focuses on some of the most interesting countries in the world and gives you a deep dive into the culture, the history, the geopolitical context, and the people. We've been talking a lot about Russia, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Caucasus up until now, but today we're making a little bit of a transition. In fact, more than a little bit of a transition. We're making a quantum transition to another fascinating country. That is the country of Afghanistan. This will be a multi-episode series because my time in Afghanistan simply cannot be encapsulated into one episode. The country's too complex. There's too much that has happened down through history, especially in recent history. So we're going to take a few episodes to dig into the Afghan experience and talk about its people, its culture, its history, and its geopolitics. My experiences in Afghanistan are chronicled in my memoir, Some Stops Along the Way. It's available on Amazon. Love for you to get a copy, give it a read, and provide feedback on the Amazon site. That'll make me better, and it'll help others know whether this is the kind of book that they're interested in or not. So, let's talk about Afghanistan. To really understand how I got to that fascinating country, and it became, by the way, one of my longest postings in my international development career, almost 4 years, 3 years, 10 months, and 9 days, but who's counting, right? It wasn't planned to be that way. I went to Afghanistan initially for 6 weeks to see if there was some opportunities for the company I was with at the time, the Center for International Private Enterprise. I was asked to go to Afghanistan from Romania as our project was winding down there after 3 years. The executive director of the Center for International Private Enterprise, called CIPE, Dr. John Sullivan at the time, had just been to Afghanistan, had unearthed what he thought were some interesting potential opportunities, and he asked me to go follow up to see if there were some things that our company could do to support the transition effort between the dislodged government of the Taliban and the new interim government at that time of President Hamid Karzai, which was backed by the United States and the coalition that dislodged the Taliban. So in October of 2003, when I departed Bucharest Otopen Airport for Kabul, Afghanistan, via Baku, Azerbaijan, I didn't know what to expect. And even if I had, I don't think that my expectations would have been realistic based on what I found when I got there. And I'll talk about those in just a moment. But first, I want to show you some things. In Afghanistan, there were so many interesting cultures and traditions, and we'll dig into a lot of those. But one of the things that I found very quickly when I arrived in country is that because of the security situation, it was very important that we take precautions. So I traveled with armed guards. We had armed guards around the compound when I was there. But this was also very important as well. This hung around our necks, and it not only had our ID in it, but it had something that was even more important than that. It had our blood type. And everyone knew in Afghanistan that things could happen. We obviously hoped they wouldn't. We prayed they wouldn't. We prayed for God's hand of protection every time we left the front gate of the compound. But if something happened, you needed to have your blood type on you. And that's what we carried in this little pouch around our necks all the time. Some other interesting things that I brought back from Afghanistan, and you'll see a lot of them as we go through this podcast, but I want to show you some interesting things here that I brought back that we'll talk a little bit more about in future episodes, but I wanted you to see them for yourself. The first is called a chapan. That is a robe. The Afghan men especially would wear these most usually in the winter, but they are silk. They're made of bright colors, usually this green and purple as you see here. And you might have seen pictures of former President Hamid Karzai wore a robe like this on a regular occasion. And I brought back a couple from Afghanistan while I was there. Both were gifted to me by dignitaries there. Also, we have the caracal hat. This hat is made out of wool. It's most usually worn with the chapan. And again, most usually in the wintertime, but something that was very common there to see men wearing this type of hat. Another type of hat is the pakal. This was a more common hat worn by average Afghans on virtually a daily basis. It's made out of wool. It's flat on the top. This one is more touristy. It's more ornate than you would see most of the pakals. But I just thought that you would like to see it along with some of these other things that I brought back from the country. So I knew that Afghanistan was going to be interesting, to be sure. But I had no concept of what was going to happen when I landed there in early October of 2003. I should have known that something was up, though, really. Because when I flew from Bucharest and left my family there, Debbie and Daniel stayed in Bucharest so he could finish high school. I went to Afghanistan for what I thought would be a relatively short trip. And I flew through Baku, Azerbaijan. I should have known then that I was in for an interesting experience, because I got to Baku, and not only were the procedures in the airport, let's say, convoluted, but also they took my passport and they said, "Oh, there's nothing wrong with your passport. Everything's in order, but we need to review it and we will give it back to you before your flight to Kabul." So I sat for several hours in the Baku airport with no passport, wondering if they were really going to do what they said they were going to do. Well, sure enough, about 30 minutes before the flight to Kabul, they come back with my passport. It's been stamped, and so I'm good to go. Strange, but not apocalyptic. The plane lifts off from Baku. We take the short flight to Kabul, and from the moment we approached Kabul, I got a little bit of a glimpse of what I was in for. I looked out of the window of the airplane, and the first thing I noticed was the rocky desert climate. All around Kabul, there were mountains that were devoid of foliage. They were rock and sand. The type of desert that is in that part of Afghanistan is not like in Saudi Arabia and the Sahara, where you have sand dunes. You have sand and rock. And obviously there are some things growing there as well, but it's a very arid environment. And those stark mountains around Kabul are something that really made an impression on me in the beginning. Also, as we were flying in, I looked down as we were approaching Kabul International Airport, which in itself at that time was quite funny. Later on, the expats in Afghanistan referred to Kabul International Airport as KIA, which we thought was funny because it was killed in action, Kabul International Airport. Because of where we were and what was going on at the time, we amused ourselves a great deal by that acronym. Now it's called Hamid Karzai International Airport. But as we approached that airport and I looked down, there were so many blown up airplanes all along the tarmac in the field next to the airport that were either blown up or burned during the fighting when the Taliban were dislodged by the United States and its coalition partners and the Mujahideen, the opposition coalition, in 2001. So I took a deep breath and mentally I said, Mark, get ready, because from what I can see from the air, it's going to be chaos on the ground. And sure enough, the moment that airplane door opened, it was chaos central. People jumping off the airplane, running toward the terminal. I get in line for immigration, finally snake my way to the front. There's a dilapidated kiosk there with a soldier sitting behind it in an ill-fitting suit that was stained and obviously very dilapidated, threadbare. He takes my passport, he looks at it, he looks at me, he looks at the passport. He looks at me, he looks at the passport. He looks at me again, he looks at the passport. He calls another guard over. They talk about it in Dari, the local language, for a while. Then he looks at me again. Then he talks to someone else. And finally, after about 10 minutes, he stamps my passport and hands it to me. So I move past that kiosk and I think, okay, the hard part's over. Now I just need to get my luggage and meet my handlers who were supposedly waiting for me at the airport. Well, getting the luggage at Kabul International Airport was an experience in itself, because they didn't have a luggage conveyor belt like most modern airports do, because this was far from a modern airport. In fact, you couldn't even see a modern airport from here. It was very dilapidated, old, damaged in the war. So I walk up to baggage claim, and literally it is a hole that has been knocked in the wall. And the baggage crew's on the other side of the wall, and they're throwing luggage through that hole. And finally, out comes my luggage, thrown through the hole. And before I could get there, a young boy ran up and grabbed the luggage and pulled me on the sleeve, asked me to follow him. So I follow him outside, paid him a little money for carrying my luggage. Probably paid him too much, because at that time I didn't know what the conversion rate was. So he probably made a very good deal off of me that day. And looked around for my handlers. The young man who became my program officer and most trusted advisor while I was there, Bismillah, and our driver, Noor. I can't say enough about these two guys. Not only were they there to pick me up at the airport that first day, but they became very close friends. They were there whenever I needed anything. I can confidently say I would not have lasted in Afghanistan without these two guys. There were many others that poured into my life as well, but Bismillah and Noor were just two fantastic people who wanted to do the right thing and were excited about the work that we were doing. So finally, in this deluge of people that were outside of the airport, I finally connected with Bismillah and Noor. We get the luggage put into the SUV. We began driving out of the airport grounds toward what I thought was the guest house that I had booked online. Now, realize the internet was not then like it was now. And so when I was in Bucharest, I had done an internet search, and the only thing I could find in Kabul was a guest house to reserve. And so I thought I had done that. Besmillah and Noor had never heard of this guest house, so we drove around for quite some time trying to find it because there were no street signs, no addresses at all. And so finally we find this guest house, and the reservation I thought I had, turns out I didn't have. But that was okay, according to Besmillah, because he said, Mr. Mark, you don't need to stay here anyway. This is a bad place to stay. It's not safe. We'll take you to the Intercontinental Hotel. Well, now, don't get excited. I know that you probably think the Intercontinental Hotel was some type of five-star palace, but it was far from that. In fact, it wasn't even an Intercontinental Hotel anymore. The Intercontinental franchise had been taken from it years before, and this hotel was in West Kabul, sitting up on a hill. West Kabul had been a scene of very heavy fighting during the war. It was still torn up, lots of damage, destruction. Even this hotel had been damaged. But we finally get to this Intercontinental Hotel, and they had one floor in the hotel that had been renovated to Western type rooms. So we go in the hotel. Besmillah talks to the front desk clerk. It's quite an extensive and animated conversation, arguing back and forth. Finally, Besmillah says, yes, you can stay here and book me a room. Well, evidently, that didn't go over exceedingly well with the management. I don't know whether it was the rate I got or what it was, but from that day forward, and I was in that hotel for a little over 4 weeks until I rented a compound in another part of the city, in an area of the city called Wazir Akbar Khan. I was in that hotel over 4 weeks, and every single day, the manager of that hotel tried to throw me out. Even though we had already paid, every day he wanted me to go. To this day, I don't know why that was. But every day I had to make the case to stay. But I had a handful of aces because possession is 9/10 of the law. I was already in the room, and I made it clear that I wasn't leaving until I leased someplace else to stay. And so he could complain all he wanted to. I wasn't going anywhere. And boy, did he complain. So after a little over 4 weeks, we rent a compound, and I'm finally moving out. And that morning at breakfast, I see the manager of the hotel. I walk up to him, and he spoke quite good English and said, good news for you today. This is my last day here at the Intercontinental. Released a compound. I'm moving out. And I'll never forget it. He grabs my hands and said, Mr. Mark, no, Mr. Mark. Don't do that. We like you. We want you to stay. Please stay. And I was absolutely, as the British would say, gobsmacked, confounded. This guy tries to throw me out every day for 4 weeks. And the day that I finally leave, he wants me to stay. That's one of the things, of the many things in Afghanistan, that you just have to scratch your head and say, I have no idea. I found out very quickly that there, on a daily basis, were things that happened that I had no idea why they happened or even what happened. But I learned to appreciate and respect the Afghan people because they did what they needed to do to survive. It's what they had always done. The culture and the society there was so steeped in tragedy that they really expected bad things to happen. And therefore, they were in survival mode almost all the time. So before I go on with my experiences of my initial impressions of Afghanistan, you really need to understand some of the context, the history and the culture of this very fascinating country, because that'll make what I say later on more understandable. So let's dig into this a bit. Afghanistan's history goes back more than 50,000 years. And one of the major reasons that Afghanistan was fought over by so many different groups and invaded by so many different groups and traversed by so many different groups is because it was a critical trade route along the Silk Road. The Silk Road appeared during the 1st century, and Afghanistan flourished with trade from the Silk Road that ran from China all the way to Istanbul, more than 6,400 kilometers, 4,000 miles. And it played a role in facilitating the economic, cultural, political, and religious interactions between the East and the West. This made Afghanistan not only a trade route, a major stop on the trade route, but it made it a place that was desirable for a lot of different entities down through history. And it infused different culture and different ethnicities and different worldviews because of all of the varied types of people that traversed through Afghanistan down through its history. You may or may not know that Afghanistan is popularly referred to as a graveyard of empires. Throughout its history, it's witnessed numerous military campaigns, including those by the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Maurya Empire, the Arab Muslims, the Mongols, the British, the Soviet Union, and then, of course, in 2001, the U.S.-led coalition that dislodged the Taliban. It is a place where war, coups, violence of all types became commonplace. A lawless place, a place with very little rule of law, a place that was truly bohemian and wild. It also served as a source from which the Greco-Bactrians, the Mughals, and others rose to form major empires. It was influenced by Iran and India. It was the center for Zoroastrianism, the Iranian religion. It was influenced by the Greeks. It was influenced by the Buddhists and the Hindus. But of course, later on, the primary influence in Afghanistan, and it lasts to this day, was Islam. So the modern state of Afghanistan began with the Durrani Afghan Empire in the 18th century. And Dost Muhammad Khan is sometimes considered to be the founder of the modern Afghan state. But it became a buffer state in the Great Game. And the Great Game was the push and pull between two different empires, the British Empire and the Russian Empire. From India, the British attempted to subjugate Afghanistan, but were repelled in the First Anglo-Afghan War. But the British succeeded in winning the Second Anglo-Afghan War. There was a third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919, when Afghanistan became free of foreign hegemony and emerged as an independent Afghanistan in 1926. A monarchy was established then, and that monarchy lasted until it was overthrown in 1973. The last king of Afghanistan was named Zahir Shah. We'll talk a little bit more about him in a few moments. After 1973, the Republic of Afghanistan was established, and that lasted until 1978, when there was a communist revolution and the socialist government took over in Afghanistan. This period of Zahir Shah, the king, especially in the 1950s and 1960s and early 1970s, was really a golden age in Afghanistan in some ways. Women were free to study. They were going to university. There was art, there was culture, there was music. People from all over the world were traveling to Afghanistan to see this profoundly interesting and beautiful country. Hippies from around Europe and even the United States were heading to Kabul because it was a cool place to be and a safe place to be. But all that ended when Zahir Shah was overthrown. And from 1973, and especially from 1978 on, after the communists took over, the deconstruction of Afghan society really began. So the communists took over in 1978, and the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 to prop up the communist government. Almost immediately, they encountered huge opposition from the Mujahideen, the Afghan opposition groups, the warlords who came together to fight against these invaders. And they fought valiantly against the Soviets. But it was really a losing proposition in many ways until the United States stepped up and really ratcheted up support for the Afghans, and especially when they got the Stinger missiles. If you've seen the movie Charlie Wilson's War, you know a little bit about the background of how the Afghans got Stinger missiles from the United States, and it really changed the game, because no longer did the Russians have air superiority. Now the Afghans had Stinger missiles that could bring down helicopters, bring down airplanes, and this was really the beginning of the end for the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. The Russians withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. And even when I was there, from 2003 to 2007, you could see burnout Russian armored personnel carriers, tanks, etc., all over the country. As a matter of fact, on the cover of my book, I'm sitting on a burned out Russian tank that was out in the middle of the desert. And then, of course, there was a period of civil war, because once the Russians were gone, the Mujahideen turned on each other, and the warlords began to fight each other for control of various parts of the country. It was absolute chaos. And this chaos bred so much angst within the country and destroyed the economy and made it an absolutely lawless, dangerous place, that the people were so desirous of some type of order. And that's what the Taliban provided. Initially, the Taliban came to power because they said, we are going to restore order in this country. We're going to make it an orderly society that is based on the tenets of Islam. And for a while, they did that. They came to power, and initially, things went fairly well. But very soon, they began to take on a hardline approach to Islam, which erased any rights that women had, forced them behind burqas, forced them into their homes, didn't allow them to study. It became a very constrictive Islamic society. and one where no argument was tolerated. There were strict rules in society. You couldn't watch television. You couldn't listen to the radio because that was anti-Islamic in their interpretation. The men all had to wear a beard, not just a beard, but a beard of a certain length. Women couldn't leave their house without a man, and if they did leave their house, they had to wear a burqa. Women and girls couldn't go to school. It went from a totally lawless society to one that was strictly controlled by the Islamic pedagogy, the mullahs. And of course, its leader at that time, the senior mullah, was Mullah Omar. And then the planes hit the World Trade Center, September 11, 2001. And by later that year, the United States and its coalition partners were invading Afghanistan. They pushed the Taliban out of Kabul. They essentially defeated the Taliban. They pushed them out of Kabul into the Panjshir Valley, where they were just decimated by the forces of the Northern Alliance, the Afghan forces, many of which had been mujahideen, that now were fighting on the side of the American coalition to dislodge the Taliban. And I'll tell you more about that period later on. But one of my most enduring photos of that time that was given to me by a former Afghan minister is a tank coming into Kabul on the day of the liberation, because the Americans pulled back and they waited for the Northern Alliance soldiers to enter Kabul and liberate Kabul. And there's a tank coming down the street in West Kabul by this bread factory that I passed many times on my way to the Ministry of Commerce, that had huge mortar holes in it. It had been damaged heavily. But this tank is coming by, and the Northern Alliance fighters are on top of the tank, and they're waving their AKs in the air. And people are running from their houses out into the streets, and they're rejoicing. And some of them even got their hands on radios, and they were holding the radios up in the air, because now they were free to listen to the radio, to connect with the outside world, to shave their beard if they wanted to. It was a glorious day. And when I got there in 2003, we began our work in rebuilding the economy of that country, and we accomplished some great things. I'm very proud of what our teams accomplished there, and I'll talk more about that in future episodes. But of course, all of that work that we did, and that many other implementing partners did, not just on behalf of the United States, but other countries as well, much of that is now gone because of the U.S. and coalition forces' withdrawal from Afghanistan under the Biden administration. Everyone knew the Americans and the other international coalition partners weren't going to stay forever. Everyone knew that. In those early days, the guerrilla war that happened between the Taliban, who fled to the hills and fought against the American coalition, they fought valiantly, but they were in a losing proposition. There was no way they were ever going to win. The American coalition controlled the skies, they controlled the ground, they had all this equipment. Taliban were never going to win. So at some point in time, they would undergo terrorist actions, suicide bombings, IEDs. There was a lot of death and destruction during that period. But we all had hope because we knew that there's no way the Taliban can win. They can't come back because, A, militarily, they can't defeat the coalition forces, and B, we were restructuring the society in a way that the people were going to themselves have every reason not to want the Taliban to come back. But at some point in time, and this primarily happened after I left in 2007, the Taliban made the decision that they weren't going to fight a conventional guerrilla war anymore. They realized they couldn't win. So at some point in time, they made the decision to fade back into the hills, and they would create problems here and there and undertake guerrilla actions here and there. But for the most part, fighting wasn't what they wanted to do anymore. They were playing the waiting game. Because what they knew is that eventually the American public and the public in Europe and Canada and Australia, with all the other coalition partners, would get tired of spending the money and tired of having their forces in Afghanistan. And eventually, they would leave. And that's exactly what happened. And when they left, the Taliban, who now has regrouped, reorganized up in the hills, they've embraced some technology, so they even have a website, they have a Twitter account, they have an Instagram account. Now, they come in and take over. The evacuation of Afghanistan by the Americans was one of the most taciturn and off-putting events that I've ever seen. It just gave me a pit in my stomach. It made me sad. And quite frankly, a couple of sixth graders at recess could have come up with a better plan than we had to evacuate Afghanistan. First of all, we closed Bagram Air Force Base, which was the way out for the Afghans that helped us. And we evacuated everyone through the national airport, which was almost indefensible. If we had left Bagram Air Force Base open, we could have processed all of the visas for the Afghans who had helped us during the years that we were there, because they were going to be targets of the Taliban once we left. We could have processed visas for them. We could have gotten them out. And when they were gone, then our troops come into this secure base, Bagram Air Force Base, evacuated, and we leave Afghanistan. But that's not what happened. Instead, we did it in the most chaotic way possible. We left the people that had helped us behind, just like we had done in Vietnam all those years before. And it was an absolute nightmare with people getting out of Afghanistan. And to this day, we're still trying to get some of the Afghans who have helped us to safety. Didn't have to be that way. Some of them were rounded up by the Taliban almost immediately, and we don't even know what happened to them. Didn't have to be that way. Unfortunately, we learned nothing from the evacuation of Saigon. And I don't want to go on a rant about this, but I feel very passionately about it. So, all of the things that happened that led to first the American coalition invasion and then ultimately its departure and everything in between, it ties back to some embedded cultural and geopolitical context within Afghan society. First of all, ethnicity. You may know that Pashtuns are the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. They comprise about 42% of the population. And that's followed closely by the Tajiks, who comprise about 27%. Two other major ethnic groups are the Hazaras and Uzbeks that are about 9% of the population apiece. And then there are 10 other smaller ethnic groups. But the Pashtuns, of which the Taliban were aligned, were the major group in the country. Afghanistan is very steeped, as I said, in the Islamic religion, although many religions were part of Afghanistan's culture. Even Buddhism. You probably heard that in Bamyan, during the Taliban reign, they blew up two huge Buddhist statues that were carved in the hillside, ancient statues, and they blew them up in one day because they felt like they were anti-Islam. So the Taliban destroyed virtually any trace of religion that wasn't Islam. But it's more than that, because a vast majority of Afghanistans are of the Sunni Islam faith. There are two primary groups in Islam, and I don't want to oversimplify it because Islam is a very intricate and complex religion, but there are two large groups that encompass the biggest part of Islam, and that's the Sunnis and the Shias. The difference between the two is not really one of faith, it's more of political distinctions. Over the centuries, political differences spawned differing practices, even within Islam. Let me give you an example. Sunni Muslims emphasize the authority of elected caliphs or elected leaders, whereas Shia Muslims hold that the leadership in Islam should remain within the Prophet Muhammad's family. So the division between the Shias and the Sunnis date back to the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632. And at that time, there was a question as to who would take over leadership of the Muslim nation. The Sunnis became the largest branch of Islam. In fact, the word Sunni comes from sun in Arabic, which means one who follows the traditions of the Prophet. Even though both of these groups have the basic tenets of Islam in common, these differences created not just tacit tension, but overt tension between the groups that spilled over into conflict and civil war in more than one country, in more than one Islamic country. Another thing we need to understand about Afghanistan is its economy. Afghanistan today remains one of the poorest countries in the world today. When I went there in 2003, it was certainly among the poorest countries in the world. Even though it has some significant sectors like agriculture, like mining of minerals, such as coal, copper, iron ore, lithium, uranium, rare earth metals, chromite, gold, zinc, talc, barite, sulfur, lead, marble, and even semi-precious stones. It has natural gas. It has some petroleum, especially oil shale. All of these could generate income, except that income is siphoned off to warlords, politicians, who use that money to build their own kingdoms, if you will, their own militias, their own areas of influence, while the majority of the population is desperately poor. I want to give you an example of this. In agriculture, even though it's a very arid climate, lots of things can grow in Afghanistan. But in agriculture, they're most known for growing poppy. And poppy, of course, is an input for the creation of heroin. And so when the American coalition came in 2001 and dislodged the Taliban, one of the things they wanted to do is slow, if not eradicate, the opium trade, because that would restrict the supply of heroin around the world. And so the United States and others spent hundreds of millions of dollars on what the Americans called the Alternative Livelihoods Program, which basically is hiring a contractor to go out into the fields in Afghanistan and convince farmers not to grow poppy anymore, to take them wheat seed or barley seed, sunflowers, any buckwheat, anything but poppy to grow so they could earn an income for their family. And they would no longer grow poppy, thus no opium, thus constricting the heroin trade. And this program was a failure. And I sat through many meetings while I was there, although we weren't involved in the alternative livelihoods part of the program. I sat through many meetings while I was there where senior level American officials were wringing their hands as to why is the alternative livelihoods program not working. And this showed one of the reasons why the American coalition was ultimately unsuccessful in creating the kind of system in Afghanistan that would enhance economic growth and governance for the people. We didn't understand their culture. We didn't understand their way of life. The British failed to carve out their influence in the country and to change the system. The Russians failed. Evidently, we thought we were different and we had learned from their mistakes and could be successful. Turned out not to be the case, and this is an example. Because what those that ran the Alternative Livelihoods program seemed not to understand is that these farmers weren't growing poppy. They weren't growing opium because they wanted to do that. Because the farmers were desperately poor. They weren't getting the money. The warlords were getting the money. So therefore, if these farmers didn't grow opium, the warlords exterminated them and their entire family. So we could give them wheat seed, barley seed, buckwheat, anything else to grow, and they were never going to grow it. They were going to grow opium. Because if they didn't grow opium, the warlords would erase them from the face of the earth. And no amount of money that we spent, no amount of good intentions was going to make it where they were in a position to do that. And that's why, even though we spent all that money, the opium crop increased every year that I was in Afghanistan. The heroin trade increased every year. The warlords got wealthier every year. It was the riddle without a resolution. And these warlords extended huge amounts of influence in the country. They were actually stronger than the national government. The national government spent most of its time placating these warlords who were influential in different parts of the country. And I'll talk about some of them during future episodes. There were some of these warlords that you could deal with, and I had many conversations and negotiations with warlords while I was there, and there were some that you couldn't. And there's a chapter, the first chapter actually in my book, talks about one of the warlords that was notorious, that with which we had to deal while I was there. So with all this economic capacity, it was being siphoned off. In mining, they have beautiful minerals there. Jade, rubies, lapis, you name it. But they had no technology, so they were dynamiting these gems out of the hill, destroying most of them. And what they didn't destroy, the owners of the mines who were connected to the warlords took the product, they sold it, they took the money, the miners got nothing, very little, enough to survive. Same thing that happened in the carpet trade. I have many beautiful Afghan carpets here in my home that I bought while I was there. And you may or may not know that these carpets, many of them, if they're large carpets, it may take 3 or 4 women weaving those carpets by hand over months, ruining their fingers. They start when they're children, and because the children can make the smallest knots and therefore the most expensive carpets, by the time they're in their late 20s and 30s, many of the women's fingers were gnarled up because of this hard life that they lived in weaving carpets. And yet they were making virtually nothing. They would weave the carpet, a middleman would come and take the carpets, take them to Pakistan, sell them to brokers there. Those brokers would export them to the United States or to Europe, sell them for tens of thousands of dollars, keep most of the money, and give the women that actually did the work virtually nothing and sometimes food to survive on. While I was there, we started a program called Afghan Mark, where we worked with the women themselves to market their carpets around the world. And we actually took 3 Afghan women who had never been out of Afghanistan to New York City in 2006 and displayed 50 to 60 Afghan carpets at the Rubin Museum in New York City. And these women were there. And each one of these carpets had a picture of the weaver on them. They had a little bio about the woman who had participated in weaving that carpet. And as we were getting ready to ship them to the United States and we were at the warehouse, one of the women saw her picture. She couldn't read, but she saw her picture and she said, "Is that me?" And our interpreter said, "Yes." And she said, "People are going to see that I wove this carpet?" He said, "Yes." And she began to cry because someone was going to know her name. Someone was going to know her face. Someone was going to know she existed, that she did something. And that's before she even knew that she was going to get, the carpets were going to be sold in the United States and she was going to get a portion of the money that she, in the amount that she'd never even seen before, life-changing for an Afghan family. So at the Rubin Museum that night, in 2006, February, every one of those carpets was sold. And my wife loves to tell the story about one of the Afghan women. Someone had written a check for one of the carpets, a big check. And she came to my wife and said, "Miss Debbie, what is this piece of paper?" And Debbie said, "Oh, Khadija, that's money. That's money for your carpet." "But how is this money? It's a piece of paper." "Well, we'll deposit it in the bank and you'll get money for this. And the ladies that helped you weave the carpet will get money as well." They'd never seen anything like that. They had no concept of the amount of money that these carpets were selling for. And now they could get the money themselves and change their lives and have an education and their children have an education and have health care. And that program worked very well for many years and changed the lives of thousands of women. And then when the Taliban came back, when the Americans left Afghanistan and the Taliban came back, it's all gone. It's all gone. I know this episode's not really uplifting, a lot of tragedy. But you can't tell the story of Afghanistan without talking about the tragedy. Is there hope? Yes, there's always hope. Because the Afghan people are resilient. They're smart. They're hardworking. So there's always hope. But that hope that we felt in 2003 when I got there, that we could do something that no other country who exerted influence in Afghanistan had ever done, and that is to create a system of governance that would benefit the people. That feeling of hope decimated over the years. If you want to read more about Afghanistan, I would suggest, I'm going to suggest 3 works of fiction and 1 work of nonfiction for you very quickly. One of them is The Bookseller of Kabul. I actually knew the guy that owned this bookshop. His name was Shah Mohammed Reis. And this book was written in 2002 by a Norwegian journalist and translated into English in 2003. And it's a fantastic look at how Afghan families work. The second book I'll recommend is called The Kite Runner. It was, maybe some of you have seen the movie. Pardon me. It was published in 2003 by Khalid Hosseini, about a boy named Amir and his experiences during the rule of the Taliban and the other periods of war in the country. He followed that book with another called A Thousand Splendid Suns that he published in 2007 about a girl named Miriam who's from Herat and marries a shoe cobbler from Kabul. And another young lady, Layla, who is forced to marry Miriam's husband, and thus their lives intersect. Those are three works of fiction that I recommend to you. You can find them on Amazon. The work of nonfiction that I will recommend is a brilliant book by Peter Hopkirk called The Great Game, A Struggle for the Empire in Central Asia. It really puts a lot of what we're going to talk about in these upcoming episodes into context. So let me just take a few minutes at the end of this first session about Afghanistan to tell you how 6 weeks turned into almost 4 years for me. Immediately, we began to get contracts there because the United States government was desperate to get traction in economic growth in Afghanistan, and that's what we did. And so we launched a number of programs there that were very significant. We rebuilt the National Chamber of Commerce, rehired the staff, got it moving forward again after years of dormancy during the war. We started the first Afghan Women's Business Coalition that was run by the women themselves. Groundbreaking in Afghanistan, never been done before. The women could make their own decisions. They had their own money. They could generate revenue and spend it themselves. It was such an empowering program. And my project did that. We integrated entrepreneurship training into Afghan schools, both boys' schools and girls' schools, that taught young people about entrepreneurship and helped them make crafts and sell those crafts and earn income for their families. We advised the Ministry of Commerce on economic policy in Afghanistan. The work was so fantastic and the people were so wonderful that it was worth the danger. It was worth the bitter cold in the winter with no hot water and the searing heat in the summer with no air conditioning and the lack of electricity and the loneliness and sometimes the despair. It was worth it all to give people who deserve some hope in their lives, who had never had it before, the chance to have some hope. And that's the thing that the Taliban can't undo. They can take society back to the way it was with strict Islamic rules, but they can't take away the empowerment that people got during those years. They can't unring that bell. And that's why there's still hope for Afghanistan today. We're going to delve more into my experiences there and the profoundly interesting country of Afghanistan over the next several episodes as some stops along the way. I hope you'll join me. Thanks for joining today, and I will see you next Monday.